Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly, and I'm with ePoster Boards. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just have a couple of housekeeping announcements to go over before we begin. If you have any technical issues, please send a private chat message to Jenna Britt to troubleshoot. You can find Jenna at the top of the participants list in the host section. If you're having trouble seeing the presentations, please refresh your browser tab. Your chat tab will automatically be open to the general chat. Use the general chat for general discussion and words of encouragement for the speakers. Clicking the back arrow will take you to the full chat list where you can chat with anyone at the table you are seated at or privately with an individual in the lecture hall. Each panel will have a live moderated Q&A. There are two ways to participate in the Q&A. You can click on the Q&A tab and type in your question, making sure to specify who the question is for, or you can click the raise hand button to be brought on stage to ask your question verbally. If you see a typed question that you like, you can upvote it to move it upwards on the list. And please submit questions at any point during the panel so we can get to as many possible in the time allotted. If you would like to exit the lecture hall, the link to the lobby is posted at the top of the general chat. Please also notice the agenda icon on the right-hand side of the top bar. Open that to see the full event schedule for the day shown in your local time zone. Thanks again. We'll go ahead and begin with our welcome remarks.
Great, thank you, Kelly, and thank you all for joining us for the National Academy of Engineering's workshop on sharing exemplary admissions practices that promote diversity in engineering, sponsored by the National Science Foundation. I'm Beth Cady. I'm a senior program officer at the National Academy of Engineering and the PI on the NSF grant. And I'd like to first introduce the chair of the planning committee, Darrell Pines, who's the president of the University of Maryland. Darrell, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Darrell Pines, and I'm the president and Glenn Martin Professor of Aerospace Engineering at the University of Maryland. And I'm also chair of the workshop committee on sharing exemplary admissions practices that promote diversity in engineering. I want to take this opportunity to thank my fellow committee members, Beth Holloway, Beth Myers, Andrew Williams, and Teresa Maldonado. I also want to thank the incredible Beth Cady from the NAE staff for organizing this exciting workshop during truly challenging times. She indeed deserves a medal for that effort. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you virtually to this important workshop. During the past 15 months, the United States and the world has experienced multiple pandemics, including the havoc wreaked by COVID-19 and the long festering wounds of racial injustice in our country. As many as you know, calls to increase diversity in engineering in the United States have occurred for decades, but the field still lacks the diversity that would ensure inclusive excellence going forward. Women, underrepresented minorities, including African Americans, American Indians, Alaskan Natives, and Hispanics of any race, individuals with disabilities, and individuals from other marginalized populations are not present in engineering education or workforce at percentages equal to their representation in the college population and society at large. For example, in 2015, women were 21% of the undergraduate student body and underrepresented minority students were 16% in engineering. Not only is it a social justice imperative to give individuals from all backgrounds access to the benefits of an engineering degree, including high salaries and job satisfaction, it is critical to U.S. competitiveness to broaden the potential talent pool to include all students. Because creative and innovative solutions to societal problems arise from the background and life experiences of engineers, lack of diversity causes an opportunity cost, a cost in products not built, in designs not considered, in constraints not understood, in processes not invented. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are needed across the system, including recruiting, admitting, enrolling, retaining, graduating, and graduating engineering students. This workshop focuses on admissions as one of the bottlenecks in the system. Our goal is to document successful admissions policies and programs and to showcase the institutions that have developed them. We want to widely disseminate information about them, promote their adoption in other engineering schools in the United States, and chart a course for future research on admissions criteria, metrics, and policy. Because this issue of racial equity is so important, the American Society of Engineering Education's Board of Directors has approved the 2021-2022 ASE Society Year to be the year of impact on racial equity. The year will begin at the end of the 2021 annual conference and end after the 2022 annual conference. ASEE's plan this year is focused on making organizational change with engineering student organizations, colleges of engineering, ASE constituent groups, and organizers of pre-college outreach efforts. Specifically, they are focused on empowering student organizations, implementing equitable policies and practices, and opening up access to engineering for all. All of this is consistent with our workshop focus. Thus, we have a number of exciting sessions and great speakers lined up to start the discussion of exemplary admissions practices. We look forward to conversations over the next 2.5 days, and we expect that they will lead to new collaborations and ideas. We will be following up with all of you, once soon and after the workshop, and again in several months. Please note that there are some whiteboards that are set up in the lobby for you all to provide daily feedback on any new ideas that you come up with that you want to share with our committee. I want to welcome you again to the 2021 NSF-funded and NAE-sponsored workshop on exemplary admissions practices that promote diversity in engineering. And now, let's get to work.
Great, thank you, Darrell. I'd now like to introduce John Anderson, the President of the National Academy of Engineering, for his remarks.
Thank you, Beth. And welcome to the workshop on exemplary admissions practices that promote diversity in engineering. The National Academy of Engineering is pleased to host this workshop with financial support from the National Science Foundation. I welcome the attendees, and I'm confident that we will all not only learn something from the next 3 days, but also act on what we've learned. One mission of the NAE is to promote the engineering profession. Recruiting more talent into the engineering profession is a key element of the mission. When representation of engineers among certain groups fall below their population representation, these groups are underrepresented, meaning we are leaving talent on the table. So the NAE is dedicated to equity, which is much more than just opportunity. Let me reflect on a personal story about opportunity, equity, and luck. My parents were in a low income situation. Neither had graduated from high school and of course did not go to college. When I was 5 years old, they moved to a rental apartment that was 1.5 miles within the border of the best public school system in the state of Delaware. The bordering school system was poorer and not nearly as strong. So yes, I worked hard, and yes, I was motivated, but boy, was I lucky. I am convinced that I would not be where I am today had I lived in a neighboring school district. And I think about that every day. Opportunity is a function of personal history and discrimination. So luck plays a role. Our goal is to reduce the importance of luck as we strive to realize equity, and re-envisioning admission processes and policies present us with an opportunity to do this. Equity requires leveling the playing field with mentoring, addressing gaps in education, and allowing for socioeconomic situations that limit a young person's choices after graduating from high school. Potential talent and promise of success in any field cannot be reduced to a single metric, such as a test score, or even grades for that matter. Other factors must be taken into account: personal situations, ability to multitask, leadership skills, motivation, etc. I have taught many students in my time as a professor of chemical engineering. Many of the top performers were not stars in high school, and several were transfers from community colleges. In fact, my more recent experiences have led me to believe that engineering colleges should recruit more students from community colleges. I also believe that college rating systems should reduce or ignore test scores in their evaluation of a university or college. The drivers to improve test scores can lead to processes with negative impact on society. As missions departments are surely thinking about these issues, I know they are, this workshop is intended to share their best practices, especially those that enhance the number of underrepresented minorities in the study and then practice of engineering. How can NEE help the goal of diversifying engineering education? In the summer of 2020, the NEE established a committee on racial justice and equity. It is composed of members of the Academy. Dr. Pines is a member of this committee. This committee is tasked to address challenges to racial justice and equity in engineering, including, first, recommend ways to make NEE members and the general engineering community aware of racial injustice and inequity, and secondly, recommend initiatives that designed to increase the percentage of engineering degrees in higher education achieved by underrepresented minorities. Members of this committee are leaders of industry and academia, and they're committed to action. The RJ&E Committee, Racial Justice and Equity Committee, has distinguished itself already with several initiatives, including the following. At the urging of the committee, a special lecture was given by Dr. John Slaughter at the 2020 annual NAE meeting titled, "We Must Let Opportunity Meet Talent." I really like that title of his talk. We must let opportunity meet talent. A recording of the lecture can be obtained from the NAE website. Dr. Slaughter, who was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 1982 and has served as director of the NSF, among other leadership roles, touched on subjects relevant to this workshop. A workshop on connecting efforts to support minorities in engineering education, funded by the Sloan Foundation, will be led by Dr. Gary May, president of the University of California, Davis. It will be held this fall, and it's sponsored by the Racial Justice and Equity Committee of the National Academy of Engineering. The NAE is partnering with the 50K Coalition because of the committee's efforts. And other workshops are in development by the Racial Justice and Equity Committee aimed at actionable recommendations for increasing diversity of the engineering profession. While the Racial Justice and Equity Committee focuses on diversity in terms of racial and ethnic minorities, the NAE is committed to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion of all individuals in the study and practice of engineering. We are committed to not leaving talent on the table, to paraphrase Dr. Slaughter. We are in this for the long haul. The National Academy of Engineering is pleased to host this workshop, and we look forward to robust discussions and new collaborations among the participants. I thank you for participating, and I turn the microphone back to Dr. Beth Katie.
Great, thank you so much, John. I'll now introduce Christine Grant, a program director in the Broadening Participation in Engineering in the Division of Engineering Education and Centers at the National Science Foundation, for her remarks.
Thank you. So thank you for having me, and I want to thank my colleagues for those comments. Before I start, I just wanted to point out that Dr. Slaughter was present at a celebration of our anniversary at NSF. He was the first African-American head of the National Science Foundation and responsible for the development of the engineering directorate. And he spoke to us a couple of weeks ago. So a lot of overlap. So I want to welcome you to this meeting. I'm very excited to be the program director who is managing this project. I joined the National Science Foundation in August of last year, and I'm on the faculty at North Carolina State University in chemical engineering. And so this is a really exciting project that you all are working on. Next slide. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about, well, you know about the workshop, but I wanted to remind you what your goals are, and that came out from the award, the abstract associated with the award. And I'm really excited to see that all these institutions have been recognized by their exemplary practices, and that you will have some robust discussions over the next few days. Next slide. So the engineering directorate, many of you know, sits in the National Science Foundation as a directorate, And within that, next slide, is the Division of Engineering Education and Centers. And my program and engineering education falls under that. Next slide. So engineering education and centers consist of 4 intertwined and interdependent clusters that result in a great team. We do a lot of things where we work together and overlap in that realm. Next slide. So many of you are familiar with the ERCs, Engineering Research Centers, that were at the Generation 4 ERCs with a emphasis on developing cultures of inclusion, engineering education, workforce development, and broadening participation. And you could probably think that these overlap, and they do. And what happens is there is synergy between these different programs, and the program officers work together to fund and support work. Next slide. So if we look at engineering education, I wanted to give a shout out to my colleague, program director, Kemi. She's over engineering education. And this is just one example of programs that are in engineering education. So there are 2 tracks under the IU's program, and you can see that there are different levels of support and different emphasis. So one is on engaged student learning, and the other is institutional and community transformation. So I don't have enough time to give you an overview of everything that we do, but I just wanted to give you some highlights. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, okay. Under workforce development, my colleague Amelia is the program director there. There's a couple of projects I wanted to highlight. I know Darrell Pines is involved with the Engineering for Us All project, but there are different programs associated with K-12, undergrad, high school, and we also have programs associated with faculty in broadening participation realm. Next slide. So this is my program, Broadening Participation, and we're seeking to strengthen the future of the U.S. workforce. We have a lot of different ways and mechanisms that you can get funding, the Career Award, planning grants, eagers, and you can see what we're trying to do, understanding the barriers, increasing access to engineering, innovate to impact student recruitment and retention, doing programs with faculty, and transforming the culture. And you can feel free to contact any of the program directors if you have more interest in what we do. Next slide. So I wanted to give you some examples of some projects under broadening participation. And this slide was actually prepared when I was doing a presentation for the Hispanic or Latina community. And you can see that there are projects that have to do with doctoral studies, Latino persistence in and beyond the degree. The NSF includes, my colleague mentioned the 50K Coalition, and then the collaborative research, should I stay or should I go? The retention of Latinx in engineering jobs. So I invite you to go look in the NSF database under the program element code 7680, that's broadening participation. But if you look under EEC, which is our whole division, you'll see all the myriad programs that we support. Next slide. So the last couple of things I want to leave with you are, there is a project that we supported a few years back, the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. Many of you are probably familiar with the ASEE data that's available online. And we supported a project that resulted in a status report on engineering education. And it's really interesting because it talks about where our students are coming from, where they're going. And of course, most of you know, and you wouldn't be surprised at the fact that the majority of our students that are going on to doctoral programs that are minority students are being produced by minority serving institutions. So there's a lot of really great information in there. The other thing I wanted to highlight is a project that was just funded by broadening participation, Jeremy London, NSF Career Award, Disrupting the Status Quo Regarding Who Gets to Be an Engineer. So that's really exciting because what we're seeing is that we have faculty whose career awards are in broadening participation. That is their scholarship. And so we're looking forward to them doing more in that realm. Next slide. And then this has got a lot on it, but I was just curious. All of these schools that are being that are part of this work that you're doing, the ones that are the exemplars, right? I was curious if they had any other funding. And I found funding for all the universities that are in this group that are being recognized, and you all are working together in this particular workshop. And I was really excited. So the details are not really important. I think what's important is that your institutions are doing more than what you're doing on this project. And I would encourage you to reach out to other people at your institutions who are doing work in this realm to connect with the work that you're doing, so they don't become siloed in the activities. So again, welcome to the meeting. And next slide. I hope that you have a great meeting. The admissions process is a very important process, and the National Science Foundation is really excited to be supporting this work. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Christine. And we'll now turn it over to Beth Holloway, who will moderate our first panel on the higher education admission system.
Thank you very much, Beth. Now we're moving on to Beth number 2. Hi, everybody. I'm Beth Holloway. I'm the Assistant Dean for Diversity and Engagement at Purdue University College of Engineering, also the Leah H. Jameson Director of Women in Engineering. And I'm really excited to be part of today's workshop, this week's workshop. I'm very excited to be able to moderate this first panel session full of really amazing folks who are doing very interesting work regarding the system of admissions within higher education. So we're going to hear from 4 people about their work, some of it more research, some of it more practice focused, and then we will have a Q&A. So I'd like to request that all of you who have questions, if you can enter your questions in the Q&A. It would be also helpful if those questions are directed to a particular speaker, if you could list the name of the speaker. So we are going to go ahead and get started. And instead of reading all of our speakers' bios, I am just going to introduce them very, very briefly, have them introduce themselves, and then start on what they would like to share with us. So first up, we have Oyan from the Spencer Foundation, and she's going to share some really interesting research with us. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Jeremy, and I'm really excited to join you today. My name is Oyan Poon. I'm office and affiliated at both Colorado State University and University of Illinois at Chicago. So today I'm going to share a little bit about some of my research. Race-conscious holistic admissions. I'm very active in various particular at SFFA versus Harvard. I have co-led the amicus brief. Research team and I had lots of questions about how exactly does race-conscious admissions work. Just a quick background on affirmative action. So the establishment of affirmative action principles in the 1950s, 1960s, race-conscious admission has shifted from remediation and redressing historical harms, racial harms, to the diversity rationale, which was first articulated by Justice Powell in the 1978 Bakke Supreme Court case, which also declared that racial quotas were unconstitutional. Despite that declaration of quotas being, we often hear a public misinformation and myth that quotas are still in practice. Secondly, rationale. In 2000, the Supreme Court these questions of race-conscious admissions and reinforced diversity rationale that was first established in the Bakke case. Now means that race has many factors considered, but in the other twin it was declared that point systems were unconstitutional because they were too rigid and not individualized. And so then individualized remained constitutional in 2003. But in 2016, in the Fisher case, Justice Kennedy again reaffirmed the consideration of race again as one of holistically. And so that gets us to holistic admissions. And the central research question in my project admissions professionals familiar with the process and who have worked at institutions that practice race-conscious holistic admissions in 2019. Individual interviews. Participants held in universities in the United States, and so they were mostly private institutions, made up the base of their experiences that they were sharing. Had a full-time professional experience in the field, and from our analysis, narrative admissions works. First, in our study, we summarized how admissions works in a linear illustration. Regardless of the institution, the admissions timeline is relatively the same, and every school's admissions process has multiple seasons. And these seasons specifically are training, recruitment, evaluation or reading, with one another and are composed of different steps. A key element in the admission cycle is these lenses I have here. There's 3 lenses that you can see on this figure that guide these seasons and priorities. They represent institutional priorities that serve and reinforce what the university values. Now, this graphic is that it fails to show how each of these things overlap with one another. And so my team and I have created this Mobius strip model to illustrate how race-conscious holistic or holistic admissions more generally. And from mathematics, for those of you who are familiar with the Mobius strip, it illustrates how complex the admissions process is. We place the 5 seasons on the strip, and as time progresses over each calendar year, and seasons can be emphasized or the principle of the Mobius strip is the form changes to the form will often be dramatic. So then in the admissions world, go optional, dropping the test often produces a big PR splash, and it seems like it's something dramatically changing in admissions. But unfortunately, what we also found was that just like the Mobius strip, minor changes means that it snaps back into place. And this is why that some research has found that going test op to minor changes in the demographics of admission outcomes and enrollment outcomes. And that's because we found that are plentiful and they maintain the outcomes. So here kind of that may be considered. And so priorities-driven admissions. And oftentimes one of the checks such as task scores and the aid budget or revenue projections, because the majority of colleges and universities, selective institutions, make sure that they're keeping the lights on, and tuition revenue is a significant consideration. And so at the end of the day, admissions processes then centering the priorities in pursuit of prestige will often push race off the table, racial diversity off the table as a key. It shows in the outcomes in admissions. And so how do we change this Mobius structure? How can we radically transform In 2019, I partnered group of a community of admissions professionals across the country interested in racial equity and justice. And we, this was pre-pandemic reimagining. We've been trying to radically reimagine admissions, and I'm excited that to hear that the NAE community is trying to do that as well. There are other communities, NACAC and NAFTA and the Common App, who are trying to reimagine what college admissions. The takeaway is that admissions is a really complex, racialized organizational practice, and it's illustrated well through a Mobius strip. On the edges is not going to create real change. We're talking about institutional priorities driven admissions that perpetuates color, evasive race. And so a couple of reasons for you all after today, and we'll talk more. Thank you so much for allowing me to present.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that opening to get us thinking about where we're going with some of the thoughts on changing admissions practices. I'd like to invite Joseph up. Joseph is from Tuskegee University, and he's going to talk to us about what has been happening at his institution. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Dr. Holloway, and good morning to everyone. The pandemic caused Tuskegee to really look deeply and look differently about how we made assessments on who was a qualified applicant versus who's not a qualified applicant. And of course, this is very difficult for an institution like Tuskegee, who was steeped in this legacy way of deciding whether or not a student was admissible or not to any particular academic programs. So to start off, historically, the university has really leaned hard on GPA, the types of classes that students took in high school, but it was also undergirded by standardized test scores that we were hard rule on that, and it made it very difficult for the office to really provide anything different in making a decision on a student who may have shown some type of promising, outcomes or promising opportunities at the university. And so from that end, the pandemic came around, which we fully understood the constraints of what that would have meant if we had retained our admissions policies. So the first step into reimagining our admissions procedures and policies on campus was to take a look at how our students perform from different educational backgrounds. We had a small subset of students over the last decade that we had admitted to Tuskegee in what we call our TU Scholars Program. And our TU Scholars Program is a small group of about 30 students that allowed us to contribute to the mission of the university by allowing students who fell below the admissions requirements to come into the university under a very intrusive program that allowed us to be able to follow them, to track them, to meet with them quite frequently, and cause them to have the kind of support to be successful. And in looking at a decade worth of information, we became a little more certain about the kinds of things that we would need to put in place on our campus for our students to be able to have an opportunity to apply test optional to the university. And so we decided that we would have two modes in which students could apply. They applied to Tuskegee this current cycle as a standard admissions. So this is the ability to apply using all of your high school academic curricula, along with an optional letter recommendation and standardized test scores, and which was really kind of where we were prior to the pandemic. The test optional policy that we put in place required students to submit an application along with showing evidence of their academic history, but we put in place a required essay and a required letter recommendation And those were the items that we used to evaluate whether or not a student was admissible to the university. The one piece that we had to do a lot of work on is training our staff around educational environments and how to assess an educational environment in which a student was actually applying from. So although we thought we kind of really knew the requirements that students, or I should say educational backgrounds of schools, we quickly learned in the training process that our counselors were all over the place in how they would determine who's admissible, who's not admissible. So we started by going through several rounds of reading students in a test optional mode by going back and rereading students as if they were test optional students from 3 years ago to see how we would have made the decisions, how we would make different decisions based upon that. And in this process of reading and practicing, our counselors learned more deeply about how to make appropriate assessments about educational backgrounds in which students are coming from, how to also consider the environment in which students are living in, and how does all of that play into us making a determination about what is best. And so we also installed a rubric to help create some standardization on how we make decisions on test optional students. Right now, as of last Friday, we had admitted over 35% of our students under the test optional policy. And the test optional students who applied this past, in this current cycle, we have about 27% of our pool of candidates applying as test optional. So you can see we've admitted more students test optional than we actually had students who applied under the test optional policy. I'm also happy to announce that we have some of our strongest academic students who have paid deposits to enroll at the university with the highest level of scholarships. And then we see test optional students through the whole pool of candidates who have been accepted for the fall of 2021 with opportunities across the spectrum of students that have been admitted to Tuskegee. So this gave us an opportunity to look at things very differently. We do have instruments in place in which we will be looking deeply at how our students are performing on the campus. We have these tools that are going to be set up to look at students in a reverse mode, looking at what was the academic preparedness from high school, what types of courses did the student take, were they a part of dual enrollment, were they a part of advanced placement, IB, etc., to really get a better understanding of a command of what curriculum is working best when students come to Tuskegee without the aid of a standardized test. So that's like the next phase that we're going in. And so we developed a tool that will help us understand that and look at kind of a regression of sorts, our validity of what kinds of courses will matter most with students being successful at the university. So that's kind of how we've retooled ourselves under this test optional policy. We do intend to continue our test optional policies, but we want to continue with some stronger evidence on what's going to make a student successful and how do we predict what that success is going to look like. Dr. Holloway?
Thank you very much, Joseph. We appreciate those remarks that you shared with us. Next, I would like to introduce Andrew from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And Andrew's going to talk about some interesting changes that they have made at Worcester and that process. So go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. So welcome, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about WPI's recent adoption of a test-blind admissions policy and our focus on the equitable influence of the SAT and the ACT. So real briefly, I'm going to go through some definitions, talk about the argument for eliminating these high-stakes standardized test scores at admissions in general, Then talk about WPI's history with the SAT and ACT, our test blind policy, and then I'll close with sort of making the case. 3 critical studies that supported our test blind admissions process that I think are helpful for others as they consider the value or lack thereof of these standardized test scores. So first of all, some definitions, real clear here. Test required, students must submit an SAT or ACT score to complete an application. Test optional, most schools since the pandemic hit are now test optional and are continuing to move in a test optional direction. But even before that, we had over 1,000 colleges had adopted test optional admissions. And now test blind, applicants' SAT and ACT scores, whether they're submitted or not, are just simply not considered as a part of the admissions process. So what's the argument for this? Well, first of all, test scores aren't needed by admissions officers to make excellent decisions, period. The SAT and ACT have longstanding problematic correlations with family income, race and ethnicity, and gender, among some other factors. And perhaps most critically, the SAT and the ACT don't even claim to predict actual student success outcomes like graduation rates. So the question I like to ask higher ed leaders who may be skeptical of this is flip it around. Let's say you were to redesign college admissions today. Nothing's taken for granted. You start from scratch. You know test scores aren't needed. You know they're poor predictors of student success. They perpetuate power, privilege, and inequities used in a selection process. The question isn't why would you, adopt test optional and test blind admissions, but why would you ever argue for the inclusion of these test scores? A little bit about our history. Back in 2007, WPI became the first nationally ranked STEM university to drop standardized test scores. We assumed that we'd be followed by many others following the data and the evidence against the use of these test scores, but that did not happen until around March or April 2020. So during this time, we got a lot of experience. And so we started to realize this problematic influence wasn't just in admissions, but also in financial aid. In 2016, as we were looking at our aid policies, we eliminated any participation in scholarship programs that use standardized test scores as a large sorting mechanism. So the National Merit Scholarship Program, over 99% of students are eliminated just through the use of test score alone. And so to us, that wasn't a great or smart use of institutional funds. And in 2019, we effectively eliminated test scores from any aid consideration, whether it be need-based or non-need-based. And just this March, we adopted a test blind admissions policy. It's an 8-year pilot. So why did we completely eliminate the use of SAT and ACT? I've gotten this question a couple times over the past few weeks. And there are a few reasons. First of all, those problematic correlations between test scores and family income, race and ethnicity, and gender, as I said before, perpetuate existing power and privilege in the admissions process. If you read Paul Tuff, Melissa Korn, Jess Salingo's books that came out all in the past year or so, you can understand some of the real issues we have in college admissions in terms of the perpetuation of power and privilege. And these test scores are perhaps one of the most glaring issues and one of the easiest to eliminate because there's really little to no risk in doing so. Test blind is without a doubt more equitable than test optional admissions, and I say that as a huge proponent of test optional admissions. A year ago, when a lot of schools started adopting emergency test optional policies and considering pilot programs or long-term changes to testing requirements, there was a lot of skepticism from students, especially for those schools who seemed to be going maybe reluctantly. And so the National Association for College Admissions Counseling partnered with test optional schools to create a campaign that basically said test optional means test optional, to try to get students to understand that we really do not care if they submit the test scores. In fact, many of us lean into that optional policy. However, with a large number of schools, many of whom were very new, and the fact that test optional means different things at different schools, what we found was that many were saying, but high scores can help you. And so students are smart, they're savvy, they know in a zero-sum game, if high scores can help you, not having a test score can hurt you. And so while this was well-intentioned, I think this is one of the things that leads to even more skepticism is that it just doesn't jive with the reality that students are seeing. And there's a ton of stress and confusion around test optional admissions. I still think it's better than the stress caused by these standardized test scores and the small number of schools who are still requiring them. But you see, should I submit SAT scores to test optional schools? Simple Google search, millions of results. And very often the first things you see popping up are pay for play, college counseling that promise students the world for a fee. And so, there's some predatory practices popping up around this. At WPI, we looked at our own data, of course, and we found that academic quality increased during our test optional admissions policy. The red line there are test score submitters, and the gray line are non-submitters. And you can see our average retention rate and 6-year graduation rate virtually identical for students who submit and those who don't submit. And finally, WPI was virtually test blind already. We didn't bake these into any sort of matrix or scoring system. They were used as context and in a holistic process, and that was simply it. So in March, our faculty approved an 8-year test blind pilot. Almost 90% of faculty voted in favor. They strongly agreed that the change better reflected WPI's distinctive education. And we're going to be doing an annual review of admissions and student success data, which will culminate in a final review that's going to consider all student success data: retention rate, 4-year graduation rate, and 6-year graduation rate. And so the case we made centered on 3 very reputable, or at least well-recognized organizations: NACAC, College Board, and ACT. So the first study is NACAC's Defining Promise 2014. It examined the outcomes of optional testing policies at 33 4-year universities. About 120,000 students were covered. And the findings were high school grades are a much better predictor of college performance than test scores. Few differences between submitters and non-submitters, despite significant differences in their test scores. Cumulative university GPAs track closely with high school GPA regardless of the test score. Students with strong high school GPAs generally perform well, despite having modest or low testing. And finally, no surprise here, non-submitters are more likely to be first gen, students of color, Pell Grant recipients, and women. Study 2, the College Board's SAT validity study, about 250,000 students at 171 4-year universities. The College Board found high school GPA is the greatest predictor of first-year college GPA. And also in the predictive value in pairing high school GPA and SAT, it amounted to a 0.61 correlation, but high school GPA alone was 0.53. So you're not getting much more by adding these problematic test scores. And also the study omitted other predictive factors like academic rigor and didn't account at all for the use of context in a holistic admissions review. Finally, the ACT earlier this year examined 200+ enrollment leaders' likely use of testing in the next 3 to 5 years. And their CEO acknowledged that we're not going back, that the test optional is here to stay, probably permanently, and test blind is growing. So the findings were that universities that were test optional prior to COVID, 20+% are likely to become test blind in the next 3 to 5 years. Those that adopted those emergency test optional policies over the last year, about 10% are likely to become test blind. And perhaps most telling, those schools that are still requiring standardized test scores during COVID, 20% are likely to become test blind in the next 3 to 5 years. So the key takeaway I'll leave you with here is that, 13 months ago, there was one school that was test blind. Now there are dozens of universities that are test blind today, and hundreds are likely to follow in the next 3 to 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Andrew. That was very interesting. And I'm sure that you all have lots of questions. I'm not seeing those show up in the Q&A yet. So please remember to put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can have a great discussion after our panelists are done. And with that, I would like to bring Hanmi up from the University of California, and she's going to talk to us about what has been happening within the University of California system. Hanmi?
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for having me. My name is Hanmi Yunwoo, and I've worked on undergraduate admissions policy development and implementation for more than 20 years at the University of California system and its 9 undergraduate campuses. I don't want to assume that everyone is familiar with public higher education in California, so I wanted to begin with some basics. The California Master Plan for Higher Education was adopted in 1960, and it identifies specific roles for each of the public higher education systems. The University of California is the state's primary research institution, and the 9 undergraduate campuses are to serve the top 12.5% of California's high school graduates. The 23 California State University campuses, the top 1/3 of the state, and the California Community College system provides open access to all students interested in post-secondary education. UC is committed to enrolling an undergraduate student body that encompasses the broad diversity of cultural, racial, geographic, and socioeconomic backgrounds characteristic of California. A diverse UC community broadens and deepens the educational experience and scholarly environment for students and faculty alike, while furthering the university's mission as a public institution that can strengthen California's social fabric. UC has long been committed to creating and maintaining a student body that reflects California's cultural, racial, geographic, and socioeconomic diversity. However, in 1996, California voters passed Proposition 209, which amended the California Constitution to prohibit the university from granting preferential treatment to or discriminating against any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. And while the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that schools may use race as a factor in admission decisions in certain circumstances, Proposition 209 categorically prohibits California universities from any such consideration. For the last 2 decades, the University of California has been able to increase the diversity of the incoming classes through race-neutral means, including the eligibility in the local context and comprehensive review policies, as well as holistic review practices. Eligibility in the local context offers guaranteed admission to the UC system to California students ranked in the top 9% of their high school class based on grades earned in their college preparatory courses. Also called the local path, this program allows UC to offer admission to students from high schools throughout the state and to recognize outstanding performance in the context of the opportunities available at each high school. The admission guarantee was originally offered to students in the top 4% of their high school class beginning in 2001, but expanded to the top 9% in 2012. ELC draws high-achieving students from every participating high school and thus supports geographic diversity and opportunities for students throughout the state. In the aftermath of the passage of Prop 209, UC also adopted a comprehensive review policy in which students applying to UC campuses are evaluated for admission using multiple measures of achievement and promise while considering the context in which each student has demonstrated academic accomplishment. Comprehensive review may incorporate traditional quantitative measures of academic achievement, as well as indicators that reflect a deeper and more nuanced evaluation of the applicant's readiness for UC education. Rather than relying exclusively on high school course completion, grade point average, and test scores, comprehensive review provides campuses with the latitude to conduct a more thorough review of every application, employing broader indicators of an applicant's readiness for higher education. And merit is assessed in terms of the full range of applicants' academic and personal achievements and likely contribution to the campus community, viewed in the context of the opportunities and challenges that the applicant has faced. The most recent development in UC admissions policy has been in regards to standardized tests. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the University of California announced on April 1st, 2020, a test optional policy for freshmen applying to fall of 2021. Then the following month, in May, the UC Board of Regents extended that policy for an additional year and allowed UC campuses to adopt either a test optional or test blind approach to freshman admission through fall 2022. The Board of Regents also decided in that May meeting that the university would be test blind for freshman admission, beginning with applicants to fall 23. But then in September, a court issued a preliminary injunction against the University of California, prohibiting UC from using the SAT and ACT for admissions in fall 2021. So in practice, UC was test blind for fall 2021. And while recent news coverage covered the settlement of the lawsuit that made some headlines, earlier this spring, all UC campuses had already announced plans to continue their test blind practice for fall 2022. And as I noted earlier, the Board of Regents had decided in May 2020 that UC would be test blind for fall 23 admissions and beyond. So you may be asking, what do UC campuses look at in its admissions review process? UC continues to assess applications in the same fundamental way under the comprehensive review policy by considering all the information in the student's application. We evaluate each student's academic achievements in light of the opportunities available to them and their demonstrated capacity to contribute to the intellectual life at UC. Students apply through a common UC application developed and managed at the Office of the President. Students self-report their grades, provide information on activities and awards, and answer 4 questions designed to be like an interview on paper. And while campuses place the highest importance on academic achievement, the review process and specific weight given to each of the comprehensive review factors considered can differ from campus to campus. Some campuses use a combination of academic index score alongside non-academic factors. And some campuses use holistic review, a method in which the totality of a student's qualifications and experiences are evaluated by trained admission readers, and no single criterion is given a fixed weight. Faculty in many of the STEM programs consider a student's performance specifically in the areas of math and science in terms of the rigor of the curriculum and grades, but always in the context of what might be available to the student. Campuses then render a decision for admission that are independent of the other campuses to meet their local campus goals and objectives. We are encouraged by the diversity in fall applications and preliminary admission outcomes, but we're going to wait and see what the results are with our in the fall with our current yield efforts and when enrollments are finalized. And so before I conclude, I did want to note that while the focus of my presentation was on freshman admissions, at UC, we have a goal of enrolling 1 transfer student for every 2 first-year students, another strategy for increasing diversity. And that concludes my presentation, and I'll turn it back to Beth.
Great. Thank you very much, Hanmi. And thank you to all of our panelists. And I would like to invite all of the panelists to turn on their cameras so that you can come up and we will start our questions. I am sure that there are going to be some questions popping up in the Q&A very soon. Here we have started, because I know that folks were just waiting until everyone had talked before they formulated their questions. So first question, well, what is the best way to evaluate applications without using standardized test scores? Is the best practice you would suggest efficient and sustainable for schools that receive tens of thousands of applications? Does anyone want to tackle that question first?
I could start out. Hopefully my audio is okay, and then I'll kick it. But I think is that institutions really start with what their mission statements are. What is it that they're trying to accomplish educationally? Teaching and learning project that their institution is trying to cultivate. And then thinking around and perhaps even engaging into what is important. What kind of learning dispositions is the particular institution looking there? Figure out, I think, the efficiency. And 20 years ago, I was in California, so 10,000s of applications. Comprehensive review is still a thing there, and so I think there are ways to think through holistic or comprehensive review is done in a way that meets the institutional mission.
Great, thank you. Any of our other panelists? Andrew.
Yeah, I'll just share that really what this amounts to is a design problem. So OEM was totally right that your admissions should start with your mission and your values. What are you trying to achieve? And very often, I think over the years, admission standards can fall out of alignment with institutional priorities as we look at other institutions and pretty isomorphic. We like to copy one another, find out what the new fad is. Maybe it's committee-based evaluation, whatever it is. Solving for the problem. I think colleges, we do a great job of marketing ourselves and purchasing names to try to communicate to students. Well, if we grow our application pools to a certain size, we have an obligation to match that with the resources to provide a fair and equitable review of those applicants. And so, many schools charge an application fee. Some of this is just making sure that those fees are directed towards supporting the review of the application. WPI, we got rid of that fee because we saw it was a barrier. And we're still able to address the challenges. Now, we certainly don't see the same application pool the size of the UC system. However, I think that higher education has shown itself over the past year specifically. We can be really resourceful when we focus on a new problem and do so with an open mindset, not necessarily trying to iterate, but trying to solve for the problem at hand. And so I think it's a completely solvable problem.
So the University of California has come up a couple times now in the response. So I feel like I need to respond myself. And as I said, in comprehensive review, we've been doing this. Our campuses have been doing the holistic review, comprehensive review for over 2 decades now. And our policy has 14 in the past 14 factors that could have been used in the comprehensive review practice in review. And test scores were just one of those 14. And so now we have 13. And so, fundamentally, it's the same practice that the campuses are going through. The greater challenge this past year, though, with the COVID was because the abrupt change in the delivery of instruction and high schools and even colleges going to changing from graded courses to a pass credit or no credit grading. We have a little less information about their performance in those classes, but I think that this is something that everyone is adjusting to, and we're looking for sort of trajectories and overall rigor in the coursework across the 4 years. And so, the way that our campuses employ comprehensive review is a little different based on each campus, but they all have some over 100,000 freshman applications alone, some very close to 100,000, and they hire an army of external readers, folks who have experience in reading applications or working with high school students. And so we did see a bump in our applications this year, and which was a bit unexpected in a way, the degree of the increase, but we do feel that it is sustainable, and it's the way that we have been doing the review for years.
Thank you. Next question, maybe I'll ask Joseph to start with this one. Once you have put into place holistic review measures or guidelines or test optional policies, what kind of training do you provide to your reviewers about how to look at those, how to think about the context and all of the data elements that you do have? And Joseph, you mentioned this a little bit earlier in your talk, so maybe you could start us off with that.
So it's a constant training that needs to happen, and also thinking deeply about where students are applying from, their communities that they're a part of, the challenges that they have in front of them, or privilege that they have in front of them. We are looking at all of those things as contextual pieces to help us have the strongest indications of whether or not a student might or might not be successful at the university. We are using that from the front end side, from the applicants, based upon what we already know from what types of students are successful at a place like Tuskegee. My institution is a very small school. We have about 3,000 students. We only are reviewing 12,000 applications a year. It is our duty to really get a strong sense of what's happening with our students in the application pool? What are the conversations that are happening, ongoing conversations with students and family members? But it's really, you know, we say we want to be family, we say we want to be close knit, but it's our duty to really learn the individual students in the decision-making process so that we're making the right decisions and that we are minimizing the risk level with students who match well with our institution. It's okay for us to say no to a student that we believe is an overmatch. You know, it's for us, it's not just about the undermatch, but it's also important that we match well. And how do we make certain that we're selecting students that we match well with?
Great, thank you, Joseph.
I wanted to also point out our readers, part of our training, they're certified every year annually, and part of the training, required training, is to go through an implicit bias training because you know, we do want to make sure that, I mean, everyone has implicit bias. They bring, you know, their own baggage with them as they're reading information, and, you know, it could be positive or could be negative, and we don't want to create a halo effect for every applicant who says that they were in the Boy Scouts because, you know, the reader was also a participant in the Boy Scouts or something like that. So it's really important that they go through that. And then, of course, the training is also very focused on the individual goals and objectives and priorities for the individual campus that this reader is working for.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo Hanmi. Implicit bias training is a must. So we do that every year, just in time for our application review process. But also on top of that, we've looked to some evidence-based research to make improvements to our process. So we've looked at the University of Michigan's Center for Higher Education Research and Michael Bastato's work there. And we've done a few things like flipping how we review. So looking at subjective criteria before quote unquote objective things like grades and previously test scores, which we believe has helped us avoid some implicit bias. And then also even changing the way we talk as we go through in committee, because we find very often, whether it's you know, a more senior person making a judgment on an applicant, it could sort of chill feedback from others, or you know, a lot of the statements that can be made if we don't check ourselves can be value-based statements rather than fact-based statements. And so we really try to, you know, if a student has lower grades than average, we'll say that student is below the academic profile rather than this student has bad grades, because when we start using language that's value, we find it can skew students one way or the other. And so you know, each cycle, I think it's important to look within ourselves and say, you know, what can we improve this cycle? Because it's really like pulling back the layers of an onion. Every time you lean in and do more work, you find even more work that your team can be doing in future cycles.
Yeah, and if I can just, I like South a couple times. I'm glad my sister scholar there that she's visiting tomorrow. That's great. Something that she has put out there, and I wholeheartedly agree with her, is the need for checks. Are you checking your data internally? I know that when I interviewed people for my study, very few people talked about training that accounted for the consideration of race. Very few people talked about, even when pressed, training specifically around racial diversity intersectionally. And that was rather surprising to me. Started telling me might invite litigation. That was really telling. And so I still think, you know, Dr. Pacel's idea of X is still worth.
Great, thank you, Boyan. And we could hear you much better. So I think maybe having your video off could be helpful.
Yes, thanks. Sorry if you hear kindergarten in the background though.
Yeah, I'm sure many of us have something like that going on in our background. So I took a few notes and questions while y'all were talking, and I wanted to ask one of my questions. So we've talked a lot about standardized tests and how, as Andrew put it, they are more correlated with family income and other certain demographics than maybe student success. But how would you talk to somebody who really thinks that their test score, and I'm assuming it might be a quite high test score, that their test score is a good reflection of their potential, and you're saying don't consider it? So maybe this one for Andrew, could you take that question?
Yeah, sure. This is the flip side of not considering test scores at all, right? As someone who has put a lot of time and often money into the preparation for these test scores, it comes back to institutional values. And so, you know, our institution is one that values broadening access to STEM for all students. And we found that the inequitable outcomes that standardized test scores reinforce, you know, have created unnecessary barriers for very qualified students. And so, you know, it goes back to that test optional is optional. You know, your test scores or your non-submitting of them won't hurt you, but in a zero-sum game, if you would allow an advantage to people who very often are already advantaged by those test scores, you introduce that power and that privilege into your process. So even in an optional process, you haven't really eliminated the inequitable influence of those test scores. And so that was a big thing for us, was that, you know, we knew we could be more equitable if we got rid of test scores altogether. And it's a question that I'll be answering very directly as we get it. Very often, you know, there's a sense of loss from people who are advantaged in these test scores because there was a perceived advantage or capability that's now taken away. But in reality, you know, I think taking that away and lowering the stress level for all students who are applying to our college is worthwhile. And definitely, while it may disappoint some individual students, we'd never admit a student who wasn't academically qualified just because they had a high test score. And I think that's one of those fallacies that are out there, that 4 hours on a Saturday morning is not going to overcome 4 years of academic performance.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Do any of you have tips for engaging / convincing maybe some reluctant faculty in this process of implementing test optional or even test blind policies, admissions policies?
I'll tell you that it was very difficult for me to start the conversation with the council of deans on campus about introducing a test optional policy, because they were pretty steeped in their thoughts about what they wanted the students to have, to be able to help them feel comfortable about, yes, this student is prepared for the academy. And then after using some, I mentioned 10 years worth of data where we had admitted these, what we call Tuskegee scholars, and looking at what disciplines that they across the spectrum of majors and across the schools and colleges, that they did well. And so it was your body of work as faculty members is displayed here across this last decade of graduates who entered your school or college that on the surface they were not prepared, but yet they did the work in the classroom, did it well enough that they were able to be awarded a degree. And so that, circling back that type of information back to the deans, allowed to bring down that kind of anxiety that they were experiencing when we first talked about going to this test optional mode. The other thing that I agreed to do is to continue to follow the students as they enroll at the university in higher numbers, so that we are able to protect our current completion rates, and then try to figure ways out on how to continue to improve completion rates at the university.
Yeah, and I'll sort of jump on what Joseph was saying here. You know, I've helped a couple schools I've worked at go test optional. WPI was already test optional when I arrived here, but just went through this process, adopting test-free admissions, and certainly, you convincing faculty is critical. In all of those cases, very different types of institutions, very different faculty. I think it's important to provide the information that faculty need. So I've done that through scaffolding, first providing sort of, public media sources that sort of shine a light on some of the problems or some of the benefits of going test-free or test optional. Then going a layer deeper, looking at some of the educational research that's out there, things like the Hack the Gates link that Oyan put in the chat. And some of those studies that I showed in my presentation. And then that builds the stage for, okay, let's look within ourselves. Let's look at our own data and let's see how these students are doing. And so, our faculty are smart, they're data driven. One question I get a lot from people who don't know as much of the inside baseball about standardized tests and what they do and don't predict is, oh, wow, you're a STEM school. I'm shocked you got faculty at a STEM school to follow this. And we gave them the data. The data was overwhelming in terms of leaving these sort of vestigial artifacts of the college admissions process of yesterday behind and evolving to a process that's more equitable, that measures more what actually matters for a school like WPI. And finally, just looking at your institutional mission and values. Again, I'll drive that point home. WPI is a leader in experience-based education and project-based learning. For over 50 years, we've had a innovative model that really focuses less on test scores and more what students are doing in small groups, collaborating, working on real-world projects, solving problems that don't have easy answers. And so, faculty, it's really weird for us to overvalue a test score when we don't really value it all that much, compared to the experience that students get in the classroom and outside of the classroom and curricular and co-curricular opportunities.
Yeah, the only thing that I would have to add is, or just reiterate, is the fact that, faculty, you have to convince them with data and also, ground it in the values of equity and access. And, and our mission as a public university is to, educate the population, the public of California, and we recognize that not everyone has equal access to quality education in the K through 12 system, and all the arguments of the test scores really are most highly correlated with family income and family parent education. It doesn't really serve our student population in our diverse state anymore.
Thanks. That actually leads to another question, is that there is a positive correlation also between high school GPA and income level. So in general, there are more inequities in the admission system, if you will, test scores, high school GPAs, than just the test scores. And we've really been focused in much of our conversation about going test blind or test optional. But what kinds of things might you do in evaluating a student from a very underprivileged background that has more than one of these inequities maybe in the deck stacked against them?
So I think that's the beauty of our comprehensive review policy, is that we're able to look at all factors, and specifically with eligible in the local context, we're looking at all the students within the same high school, so that we know the kinds of opportunities and challenges that all the students in that high school would have been facing, and not necessarily comparing students from one high school, a public high school, maybe from an urban area, with a private high school in a suburban area. Those types of students are not necessarily being compared against each other.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of introducing context into a holistic review. There are very few people who get into admissions who want to perpetuate the inequities of K through 12 education and our society at large. But we also can't fix all of those inequities through a single admissions process as well. And so it's important that we're reducing where possible, eliminating where possible. I think test scores are sort of an easy target because, again, we don't need them. they have really problematic ties to things that have nothing to do with academic performance or quote unquote merit. And we know that students are largely successful based on other factors. And so, you know, I think very few schools just look at a high school GPA anymore. Typically, it's a comprehensive review of 4 years of 30 to 40 subjective grades within courses, but those start to tell a story. We look at grade trends. We look at the academic rigor that students have had within the context of their school, again, as Han Mi was saying. And there are specific efforts to focus on implicit bias, not just in the selection process, but also as we approach the schools we're going to travel to and how we thoughtfully recruit students and do outreach. And so that's why, you know, earlier I said it's like pulling back the peels of an onion, because there's so many things we can do to reduce bias. I think test scores are really one of the easiest. And that tells you where we are in this progression of making college admissions more equitable. There is a lot of work to do. It's great that we're tackling the things that provide little to no additive value and make it more inequitable. But we absolutely have to lean into these other factors. You know, the essay, recommendations, all of these have issues that need to be counterbalanced with training, with context within the process. And I think it's important for people to know, especially those outside of the admissions offices, and we can lose sight of this sometimes. College admissions is a profession. And so people are really getting professional development. There's research around this. And I think that college admissions today is not the college admissions of 20 years ago or 40 years ago. And professionals in this field are leaning into these difficult challenges because we come into this work because we care about these things. And yes, it all happens under the layer of institutional priorities, but there's a lot that we can do within those institutional priorities to make the processes more equitable.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for a quick response, maybe to one last question. And I want to make sure that I ask this around transfer students, because I think a lot of our conversations maybe have been focused on our traditional first-time beginners. So are there particular hurdles or barriers that transfer students face? And are there things maybe that y'all are doing to promote practices around transfer students that may diversify engineering?
So that's a great question, because that's the battle that I'm fighting now with. I call it academic sovereignty, to be honest with you, and in allowing faculty to really honor the credit that's been and hard work that's been earned at another institution. And that comes with trust, that the faculty has to trust that the preparation from another institution is at the same level, that they believe that they're teaching the same congruent course, because they're always asking that next question about how are students going to perform in the subsequent courses. And so that's that's been a very difficult conversation to have with the College of Engineering and the faculty members in there in engineering, and the disciplines within engineering. It's difficult. So I can't just have one blanketed conversation about transfer students. It is now having individual conversations with each individual area to get to a common ground that we all can agree upon.
Great, thank you for that, Joseph. I think that is all the time that we have. Once more, I'd like to thank you all for sharing your perspectives and thoughts with us. It has been a great kickoff to our workshop and the rest of our conversation. So thank you so much to our panelists. I want to remind all of our attendees that you can provide feedback that are on the whiteboards that are in the lobby. And I also encourage you all to network with each other during our next break, which starts right now and goes until 1:30. And at 1:30, we will start up with a panel on admissions policy. So please feel free to network, and we will see you back in the auditorium at 1:30. Thanks.